I'm going to do a little bit of an impromptu evening. I had a whole other idea about what I was going to do tonight planned. I just came back from Lagos, Nigeria, and Venice, doing some reporting for my book about sea level rise, and I was going to talk about that. But then something happened in the election the other day, and I thought that was a pretty pressing thing to talk about. So what I thought I would do is read a little bit from this work in progress, my book that I'm finishing up in the next few months, just 10 pages or so, and then talk a little bit about the consequences of the election for climate change especially, and just sort of set up a discussion that we can then all participate in. So let me read first from, again, this is a work in progress from my book about sea level rise. This chapter is called Ice and the Naked Scientist. John Mercer liked to do science in the nude. That might not sound so eccentric, but Mercer was a glaciologist and spent a lot of time in very cold places. Maybe that's why, when the sun was out, he liked to strip off his parka and wind pants and sweaters and wander around on the ice naked with his instruments. He usually did this when it was just him and the penguins, but it was not out of, but if he was out on an expedition with friends, they knew that if the sun came out and the temperature rose, Mercer would take off his clothes. You might say it was his way of adapting to climate change. In his office at Ohio State University, where he was a senior research scientist until his death in 1989, he often wore a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and red and white canvas sneakers. But sometimes he didn't. He was once arrested for jogging nude in a public park in Columbus in the pre-dawn hours. Mercer, who was born in a small village in England, is best remembered for the work he did in Antarctica. In the 1960s and 70s, when Mercer was spending his summers there, most scientists thought they understood Antarctica pretty well. After all, anyone who flew over it could see that there were mountains and valleys and lots of snow and glaciers. Most scientists, and explorers for that matter, thought the ice sheets were a few hundred feet thick, just as you might find in the Alps or in Patagonia. Mercer's first breakthrough was to understand that this was wrong. In fact, the ground beneath the ice sheets had been depressed by the weight of the glaciers, pressing down upon it for millions of years. If you had X-ray vision and could see through the ice, you would see that the ground below the sheets was so crushed and depressed that the continent was actually bowl-shaped, and the bowl was filled with ice. In some places, the ice was 2 miles thick. Mercer's second breakthrough followed from the first. He understood that if Antarctica was a big bowl filled with ice, some of the ice sheets were sitting on the edge of the bowl, and that bowl was, in turn, sitting in the middle of the Southern Ocean. In a number of places along the coast of West Antarctica, the only thing holding the glaciers back were floating ice shelves, which grew where the glaciers met the ocean. The ice shelves acted like corks in a bottle. If they melted, the glaciers would be free to pour into the ocean. But the ice shelves weren't the only issue Mercer was concerned about. He also discovered that if the ocean warmed a little bit, it would begin to melt the glaciers from below. Remember, these glaciers are 10,000 feet thick mountains of ice. They would melt them at exactly the point where the glaciers sit on the edge of the bowl. Scientists call this the grounding line. The warming glaciers would eventually retreat behind the edge, allowing the water to spill into the bowl, further increasing the melting and accelerating the glacier's slide into the ocean. And that, of course, would cause sea levels around the world to rise. How high? Mercer did some rough calculations and came up with a number, 13 feet. To put the volume of water we're talking about here into perspective, if all 7 billion human beings on the planet jumped into the ocean at the same time, it would raise sea levels about 1/100th of an inch. As Mercer put it in a letter to a colleague in 1975, I have had some disturbing insights about possible ice sheet instability. Mercer didn't have to do a lot of deep thinking to realize that 13 feet of sea level rise would be a catastrophe for coastal cities around the world. It would be like a slow-moving tsunami that never retreated. Mercer didn't know how soon this could happen, but when he did his calculations in the mid-70s, he predicted it could be as soon as 40 years. That is, right about now. In the 1970s, the idea that burning fossil fuels created CO2 and warmed the planet was well understood, as was the fact that most of the heat in the warming world goes into the oceans first. It was also well understood that because CO2 lingers in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, the warming of the Earth's atmosphere was not going to stop anytime soon, even if humans did figure out a way to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. In 1978, Mercer tried to publish a paper describing what he had discovered in Antarctica. He may have flouted social norms by running around on glaciers in the nude, but he believed in the civic duty of scientists to provide useful information to the world. If West Antarctica was indeed unstable, people should know about it and prepare. Or perhaps reduce fossil fuel burning, which would at least slow the warming of the planet and reduce the immediate risk of ice sheet collapse. But when Mercer wrote up his findings, he had trouble getting it published. One prestigious journal called it, quote, a bad B-movie scenario, and refused to print it. Many scientists scoffed at the idea that a chunk of ice as big and as cold as Antarctica, a continent that's 1.5 times the size of the United States, was in any way unstable, much less vulnerable to rapid melting. But Mercer persisted. The journal Science eventually published his paper titled Antarctica and Climate Disaster. It was mostly ignored. One of the reasons it was ignored is because the scenario Mercer's paper described was indeed like a plot for a B-movie. You can imagine the scene. A geeky scientist is sitting in a lab at NASA scanning real-time satellite imagery of West Antarctica when, holy shit, look at the cracks on the face of that glacier. It's on the verge of collapse. The shocked scientist didn't know who to tell. He bursts into his boss's office and shows him the satellite imagery. You know what that means, don't you? The scientist tells his boss. If this glacier collapses, the melting of Antarctica will be unstoppable. And that means goodbye Miami, goodbye New York City, goodbye Boston. Corny? Yes. Unimaginable? No. The truth is we are all living in a world where bad B-movie scenarios like this could go into production at any moment. Satellite data shows that glaciers in West Antarctica are indeed melting from the warm waters below, that they are indeed unstable, and if they retreat beyond the grounding line, that is, the edge of the bowl, they could disintegrate very quickly. In fact, a number of scientists believe that the melting of West Antarctica has already passed the point of no return, and that a full meltdown is inevitable. As Eric Ringo, one of the most respected ice sheet experts in the world, explained to me recently, the fuse has been lit. You don't have to think very hard to see what a catastrophe this would be. With 13 feet of sea level rise, most of South Florida is a swimming pool, including Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa, and West Palm Beach. In Boston, about the only thing that's not underwater is all those nice old houses up on Beacon Hill. MIT and Harvard are also flooded, but cruelly, rivals Stanford and Columbia are not. In the Bay Area, everything below Highway 101 is gone, including the Googleplex. The Oakland and San Francisco airports are submerged, as is much of downtown Montgomery Street and, of course, the Marina District. Even places that don't seem like they would be in trouble, such as Sacramento, California, which is smack in the middle of the state, would be partially flooded by the Pacific Ocean swelling up into the Sacramento River. Galveston, Norfolk, New Orleans would be lost. In Washington, D.C., the shoreline would be just a few hundred yards from the White House. And that's just the picture in the U.S. The rest of the world will be in just as much trouble. Shanghai, Bangkok, Jakarta, Lagos, large parts of London will be lost. In the Netherlands and Bangladesh, more than half the country will be underwater. The Marshall Islands and the Maldives will be coral reefs. Does this mean the end of human civilization? No. But it does mean suffering, economic losses, political chaos, and a remaking of human civilization as we know it today. It's still too early to say if Mercer's B-movie scenario is headed for the Cineplex anytime soon. But the signs are not encouraging. What can be said for sure is that our lives are built around the idea that the shape of the world is stable, that ice sheets don't collapse and sea levels are fixed, and most of all, that big changes come gradually. Naked on the ice, Mercer discovered that those assumptions might be wrong. So that's, as I said, a work in progress from the book. Now I want to talk just a little bit about the election and just sort of give you some of my thoughts about the consequences of this and why it's important to think about, and then just have a discussion. Of course, everyone's flipped out about the election and what's going to happen, and what will happen with a lot of issues that we all care about, like Obamacare, Iran, nuclear deal. I mean, you can go through the list. Climate of course, didn't get talked about at all in the election, even though I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that from a sort of long-term consequences of the stability of life on this planet, that's the big issue. For our kids, for our grandchildren, for many years to come. And the brutal truth is that we just elected the only climate denier president in the free world, and with a young Earth creationist as vice president. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, it's hard to make America great again if you don't live on a hospitable planet. So I want to just make 3 points about this, about framing how to think about the importance of climate change right now. And one of them I touched on in the chapter, which is that climate change is essentially irreversible on a scale of thousands of years. When we put CO2 into the atmosphere, a lot of people think that it's like smog. We had smog in LA and we put catalytic converters on cars and the smog went away and everything was cool. CO2 is not like that. It stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So what we're doing now is changing the shape of the atmosphere for a very long time. And even if we stop emitting emissions right now, this warmth will continue. A lot of the warmth has gone absorbed into the oceans. It will continue to radiate out. If we stop completely, just like everybody went to skateboards tomorrow, we would still have about 12 feet of sea level rise. Question is how long a time scale, but that kind of warmth will continue radiating and melting the ice. So it's important to think about this as a problem that we have to think about ahead of time, because the changes we make now will take a long time to bear fruit. The second thing that I think is really important to think about is that climate change is not an environmental issue. I always get kind of mad when people say that this is an environmental issue, because it makes it seem like it's just about polar bears and birds. And it's really not. It's a human rights issue, it's a public health issue, it's a moral issue, it's many things beyond an environmental issue. And it's a political issue, right? It's an issue about the instability of many nations. I saw this for myself 2 weeks ago in Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos is the city of nobody really knows how many people, 19 million, 20 million, something like that. It's a giant, sprawling city in Nigeria. Nigeria, of course, is the richest oil country in Africa. And the whole city is at about 3 or 4 feet above sea level. And believe me, they are not doing kind of proactive thinking in Nigeria about how to deal with this. And when you think about a few feet of sea level rise and the displacement of millions of people, 70% of which live under $1 a day, and I went into some of these slums, which were unbelievable. And you think about, with sea level rise, the displacement of people in a place like that and the political chaos that will cause. We already have terrorist groups like Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. When you think about a city like that coming apart, where those people will go, and with the political consequences of that, it's pretty scary. And that's what climate change is about. It's about that kind of thing and the kind of instability that this is going to create in our world. We could talk about other places, Bangladesh, of course, moving in, millions of people moving into India. They're not exactly best friends. And then there's the cultural and historical and other human parts of this that no one thinks about. Like I was just in Venice, and you know, Piazza San Marco floods every day. I mean, it's practically a tourist attraction that people go out and play in the water on in Piazza San Marco now, you know. And they're trying to build a barrier in Venice, but the barrier is not really going to work. And Venice is, you know, there's no saving Venice really. Without turning it into unless you build a New Orleans-like moat around it and everything. But sea level rise and climate change is, you know, we're going to lose things. We're going to lose a lot of things that aren't calculated into this when we talk about this as an environmental issue. So I wanted to make that point. The third point I just want to make about how we think about this is that the reason this election and this moment is so important is we really are at this turning point. I mean, I was in Paris last year for the Paris Accord, for the climate agreement, and you know, President Obama put all of his muscle into that. Secretary Kerry was there. After 30 years of messed up climate deals that were bureaucratic nothings, Paris finally kind of came together and happened, and it's a meaningful agreement. And it's not exactly clear how well it'll work and if it'll work fast enough and all that, but there was a real coming together spirit there in the world that, okay, we realize this is a big problem and we got to do something about this. And how much they actually follow through and all that, who knows? But there was an amazing spirit that we need to do something here. And China, who had been kind of subverted some of the other agreements, was on board with us. And a lot of it was due to U.S. leadership, to President Obama and Secretary Kerry saying, we're going to do this deal, whatever it takes. And they did. And it really was an inspiring moment, I think, for anyone who thinks about this issue. And of course, one of the first things that, and I also want to say that the reason it was so important is that, you know, scientists are telling us that we really have only a few years to hit this target of what, this 2-degree target, which is where they identify dangerous changes are inevitable in the climate. Most people say that's already too high of a target, but we only have a few years to really get CO2 emissions down, to really have a chance of, you know, averting some of the worst of the disaster from climate change. And so there was a sense of, oh, it's like, we got it together in Paris, we can do this, we can, you know, the world is coming together, clean energy is getting cheaper, all this is kind of happening. There was this sense that it's happening. And of course, the first thing candidate Trump has said is that, you know, global warming is a hoax, he's going to pull out of the Paris deal. Much of the progress that has happened in the world is because of the U.S., who is the biggest emitter historically. China now has passed us in the grand total, but we're the biggest emitter historically. Has said we're going to do something, and we've done a lot. And they know Obama has done a lot of things, but it's mostly all been executive action, right? Because he can't get anything through Congress, and Congress won't even talk about it. So he's done things like fuel efficiency standards, carbon limits on coal plants, a bunch of things that gave America the moral standing to be the leader in the Paris Agreement, to say, okay, world, we're going to get our shit together and don't fuck with us, and we're going to make this deal happen. And it was because of those executive actions and things that we had the standing to do that. Well, those executive actions can be undone instantly, one stroke of the pen by the president. So Trump can undo all this stuff, to get rid of the regulations on coal plants, get rid of fuel efficiency standards, all these things. And so the question is, for the rest of the world, it's like, okay, well, if America's going to go do that, you know, why do we bother? You know, America's bailing out, well, let's bail out too. You know, there's already a lot of pressure to bail out for economic reasons and others. So this is really a kind of awful scenario because just at the moment when we got our shit together globally, along comes President Trump, who wants to undo all this stuff. So it's really an urgent urgent moment in that sense. So I'll just wrap this up by giving you a couple of things that I think could be helpful, which is always hard, but I will try. First of all, we might get a kind of break from these rising emissions and all that by a recession, which I know Trump's a businessman and he understands how the economy works and everything, but you know, we very well could have a recession, which would do a lot to bring down CO2 emissions, but would also do a lot to bring down wages and lots of other things that we don't want to happen. So we're not wishing for a recession, but that's certainly one scenario that could have an impact here. The other scenario, which is, I'm from Silicon Valley, I'm a big believer in technology as a way to solve problems and in power of clean energy and stuff. And there's an argument to be made that the whole clean energy revolution is unleashed and that solar and everything is on, and wind is all on this downward curve. And even if, President Trump, I still have a hard time saying that, goes out with a shovel himself and digs up new coal mines in Pennsylvania and, magically resurrects steel mills and everything, that this clean energy revolution is on its own and he basically can't stop it. And there's something to be said for that. I don't know that I completely buy it, but broadly I do buy it. So that's one hopeful thing. And the third, I think, most hopeful thing, weirdly, and I think most likely to happen, is that China will take over the role of the U.S. in all of this. That China understands that there's a whole lot of money to be made in clean energy, and that they want to be the leaders in this, and they're already doing amazing things, and that they're going to own this, and they're going to make a lot of money, and they're going to be the leaders on this. And they also see it as a way to gain moral stature in the world. They've been looking for ways to show that this is the 21st century is ours. America, you had the 20th century. We're 21st century. And this is a way that they can do that without having to get into complicated human rights issues and things. There are a whole bunch of things, of course, that they don't want to be standing out in front of and showing moral leadership on. But this is something that they can really do. And so I think that there's actually some hope in that. So those are the three things that I would say. And just the last thing is that, when it comes to climate here, we're in a pretty good place. When you look around the world, where we live here, we've got water, we don't have to worry about rising seas. We're relatively, prosperous. This is, people always ask me, where should I move? Where should I move? And it's like, well, you're in a pretty good spot right here. We can grow food. I mean, all these, I'm not apocalyptic, despite what I just read. I mean, I do think that this is going to all be, in its own weird way, manageable, but I do think there are better and worse places to be, and it's important to remember that we are in a good place. But it's also important to remember that we're not isolated from all this stuff, that what happens, even though we have water and food and everything here, what happens in Lagos matters to us, because if Nigeria, terrorism erupts there, it's going to have global consequences. I mean, that's why Donald Trump was elected president, because of this fear of terrorism and the outsider and the immigrants and all that. Well, you can think of climate change as an immigrant engine. And so if you think about Trump then as the manifestation of that, you can see in the future, as this unravels, where it goes. So.